For the next clip, we go back to the Strategic Marketing Call Writers Workshop. Remember back in the Power Strategy Call when Rich said teaching wordsmithing is hard? It may be hard, but Rich sets out to do it. He goes back to his book Monopolize Your Marketplace for a lesson in Chinese. How's this going to help you? Gigantor?
Number 3.
Let's take a look at wordsmithing. Wordsmithing, that's a word that I use to distinguish the difference between good and great results. This is where all the direct marketing guys focus their attention, wordsmithing. How do you write it? How do you say it? And if you read any of these books, and there's a ton of them out there about how to write copy and how to write direct mail and how to write. There's all these business writing books. But a lot of these types of books are all about how do you write stuff. And they focus real heavily on a lot of these detail-y kinds of things that we're going to be talking about today, which is great. It's good stuff. There's nothing wrong with it per se. But I want to emphasize your headlines are going to do your heavy lifting. And if your headlines are talking about the right stuff based on educational spectrum and the 3 categories of hot buttons, benefits of ownership, objections to ownership, and vendor selection, and you powerfully articulate headlines using either John Smith headlines, headline starter headlines, or headline bank headlines, you're already going to be communicating very, very powerfully. That being said, let's talk about plain English. And as we do this, I want to read you a piece out of the book called Monopolize Your Marketplace. Maybe you've heard of it. It's a pretty good book. I like it. And we're going to talk about Chinese for just a minute. If you remember the story, I was actually in Taiwan, and I am a fluent Chinese speaker, Mandarin Chinese, not Cantonese. I don't know a word of Cantonese. Let me restate that. 20 years ago, I was a fluent Chinese speaker. Now I'm a choppy, non-fluent, sort of can-speak-it person. But nevertheless, I was fascinated because at the time I was deeply entrenched in learning Chinese, and this was a very fascinating discussion. It had a lot more meaning to me because I was a Chinese speaker, but for you who is likely not a Chinese speaker, go ahead and listen to this anyway. So here's what I said in the book. It's on page 123 if you want to mark it and look at it later. Some of you think Chinese is one of the most difficult languages in the world. Well, that's right and wrong. It's true that learning to read and write all those strange little Chinese characters is difficult, but speaking Chinese is surprisingly easy. If you could apply the Chinese way of talking without much effort, you could form the habit of simple, clear, picturesque talk. Ultimately, your simple Chinese-like writing will help you make more money. I'll assume that right now all you know about Chinese is Kung Fu and Chow Mein, and you're not interested in adding to your Chinese vocabulary. So we'll do the next best thing. We'll study Chinese from the outside and get a basic idea of how it's put together. Chinese, to you, probably seems like an exotic language written in weird kanji characters and spoken in sort of a sing-song. It's true that the meaning of these Chinese words depends on musical tones, which adds one element of difficulty to learning to speak Chinese. But if you look closer, you'll find that Chinese is actually really simple. Elements that make other languages difficult, conjugations, irregular verbs, subjunctives, genders, and a host of other grammatical nightmares are completely absent in Chinese. It's known as a grammarless language. It has no inflections, no cases, no persons, no genders, no numbers, no degrees, no tenses, no voices, no moods, no infinitives, no participles, no gerunds, no irregular verbs, no articles. There are no words of more than one syllable. Every word has one form. All you have to do is learn to put these little one-syllable words in their proper order. To make it even easier, this proper order is the same as the usual order in English: subject, predicate, object. You might wonder, how is it possible to talk in such a language so that other people understand you? And you might think this must be the most primitive, uncivilized language in the world. That would be a common error. Up to about 100 years ago, all language experts agreed that Chinese is the baby talk of mankind. Turns out they were wrong. It's the most grown-up talk in the world. It is the way people speak who started to simplify their language thousands of years ago and have kept it that way ever since. We now know that thousands of years ago, the Chinese language had case endings, verb forms, and a whole arsenal of unpleasant grammar. It was cumbersome, irregular, complicated mess, like most other languages, including English. But Chinese people, generation after generation, changed it into a streamlined, smooth-running machine for expressing ideas. It's like the camera, remember? It's so advanced, it's simple. The main principle of modern Chinese is exactly the same as modern machinery. It consists of standardized, prefabricated, functionally designed parts. In other words, Chinese is an assembly line language. Let me give you some examples. If you wanted to say, I'm going home, in Chinese, you would say, 我回家, which means, literally, I go home. That's it. And you wouldn't even have to say I because it would be understood. You could just say 回家 or just go home, and everybody would know exactly what you meant. There's no filler words. If you wanted to say I will be going home, you'd still just say 回家. If you wanted to say she has 6 books. In Chinese, that would be ta you liu ben shu, meaning she have 6 book. You wouldn't even have to know the word she, because in Chinese, the word ta can mean he, she, or it. It's all determined by context. Now, back from the book, you might be listening to all that saying, okay, so what? Who cares? Here is the point. If we can simplify our English and get rid of, I'm not saying get rid of the verbs and the irregulars and the gerunds and the participles. Here's why I'm saying, if you can make a conscious effort to simplify your writing, and this is extraordinarily difficult for some people because, why do you think? That's right, because we're so ingrained, depending on where you grew up, when you grew up, and what kind of training you have. A lot of the plain English method has been taught to you as being absolutely wrong. But the fact is, in business writing, it's absolutely right. Let's look at what Rosser Reeves, the early pioneer of advertising, had to say. He said, let's say you've got $1 million tied up in your little company, and suddenly, for reasons unknown to you, your advertising isn't working, your sales are going down. Everything depends on it. Your future depends on it. Your family's future depends on it. I walk into this office, sit down in this chair. What do you want from me? Do you want fine writing? Do you want masterpieces? Or do you want glowing things that can be framed by copywriters? Or do you want the blanking sales curve to stop going down? I love that quote because it really hits home. We are not in the business as marketers of writing what he calls glowing things that can be framed. We're in the business of persuading people.
Confidence men use flowery speech and rhetoric to create false confidence in the audience to take advantage of them. We don't need to create false confidence, insiders. We have the ignition code. We have to speak plainly and simply. Like the voice going on in John Smith's head. I hate long waits at the dentist. LASIK eye surgery frightens me. Where did they hire that contractor? Off the chain gang?